Hello and welcome to our webinar, How to Lock in Esser Funding for Literacy. My name is Susan McGuire, Senior Editor, Collection Management and Library Outreach here at Booklist. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. A link to today's slide presentation was included in the reminder email you received from Zoom 1 hour ago. To download it, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and click on the link located there. You can also download the slides by copying the URL on this screen into your web browser. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions and will pass along all other questions to today's panelists so they can follow up with you after the webinar or during our Q&A at the end of the presentation. Last but not least, Booklist offers closed captioning on all webinars. To enable or disable captions on your screen, please look for and click the live transcript icon on the toolbar mentioned earlier. From there, you can select show or hide subtitles from the menu that appears. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of the captions at any time by selecting subtitle settings. We have a wonderful program for you today, so without further ado, I'll pass things off to Sabin McAlpine. Sabin partners with educators and librarians to inspire students to become stronger readers while building their confidence and finding joy in reading. Take it away, Sabin.
Thank you so much, Susan, and that is exactly how I feel. Thorndike Press is so happy to bring you today's webinar, How to Lock in Esser Funding for Literacy. What Susan didn't mention also, not only do I have extreme passion about making a difference and impacting literacy, I lead a fabulous Thorndike Press sales team, and I'm very honored to be part of an organization for over 25 years that shares the same passion that I'm sure all of you listening have, and that it's to give the gift of literacy. As we all know, this gift can change lives. I will start with a brief introduction to large print so that everyone has a good foundation for what's next. You'll then get to hear from the phenomenal Dr. Julie A. Evans. She's the CEO of Project Tomorrow, and she will share details from a nationwide study on the efficacy of large print on student reading skills and mindsets. Then she'll break down some ample Tier 2 and Tier 3 evidence that's needed to acquire Esser funding. Then we're going to hear from textbook and library coordinator for Birmingham City Schools, Dr. Christina T. Shepard Norman. Christina and Dr. Norman is the former supervisor chair for AASL, and she's also currently on the board for the Alabama School Library Association. Dr. Norman is going to share her experience with funding and approach to rolling out large print at the district level, along with a passion that she has for implementing acceleration resources that offer a path to closing the achievement gap. And before we finish with a Q&A, we have a never before seen video recording of an author that has generated a love for reading for hundreds of thousands of children, Diary of a Wimpy Kid series author Jeff Kinney, who's going to be speaking on the large print format. Next slide, please. First, I would like to ask you to think about the first time that you held a large print book in your hands and you opened that book up. Do you remember what you felt when you opened that book? Do you remember what you experienced with the ease of a larger font? If not, go to your shelves, please, and go grab one of those amazing youth large print book titles. I hope you have, but if not, grab an adult one. Open that book. Take a brief second to take in what a child who doesn't maybe love reading, who might struggle with reading, or who just hasn't found that right book would experience. I can tell you that I personally know because my daughter was a struggling reader, and the large print was a weight lifted that allowed her to learn to enjoy reading and, yes, improve her foundational reading skills. As you can see on this slide, here's a closer look at the difference between standard print and large print. Thorndike Press large print books feature a 16-point serif font for optimum letter recognition. They include wider margins and increased space between the lines to reduce tracking errors. They have fewer lines and words per page, which can be less daunting to students learning to read or who struggle with reading. All of our books are printed on high opacity, cream-colored paper that's used to minimize the bleed through, reduce the glare, and increase the contrast. And despite what you might think, because this is certainly a myth out there, Thorndike Press books are similar size and weight as a standard print edition and include the same artwork. There's no large print labels that appear on the outside of the book, and this minimizes any potential stigma. And very importantly, all of our hardcovers are library bound, and they have a 100% guarantee on the binding. And we also offer free library processing. Yes, free library processing. And with over 1,000 titles to choose from and growing, we license rights to award-winning, high-interest, and best-selling series and authors for self-selected reading. Many of our titles are curriculum-aligned favorites and contemporary classics. Our list is expansive. It's including diverse authors and characters. There is something available in large print for every reader, which is so important. I'm now going to introduce you to Dr. Evans and pass the baton on to you.
Thank you so much, Sabin. It was so great to hear again about large print. I learned a lot about large print during the study that we conducted, but thank you so much for bringing us all back into that context. Could you go ahead and move to the next slide, please? So I am thrilled to be here to share with you the results of the national study that we conducted in partnership with Thorndike Press, looking at the efficacy of large print. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my organization, Project Tomorrow, and talk about the study objectives and the methodology. That will give you the context for understanding the impact of the findings that we will then look at. Then we're going to talk about Esser funding qualifications. What do those different tiers mean? And how did this particular study that we conducted line up with those particular tiers to qualify for Esser funding? Next slide, please. So Project Tomorrow is a national education nonprofit group. We've been supporting K-12 education since 1996. We are particularly focused in on innovative learning models and tools within the education ecosystem. And most importantly, what is the impact of those new learning models and new tools on teaching and learning, in particular, student outcomes? Every year we conduct a series of evaluation efficacy studies and have been doing that work since about 2007. In many cases, we are looking at the impact of the tools on students' learning experiences. Sometimes we're looking at it from the perspective of teacher effectiveness. All along the way, we are employing scientific methodology to make sure that the study results are impactful and meaningful, especially as you're trying to make important decisions about the tools to put in the hands of your students. Next slide, please. So this was a fascinating study. As I mentioned, we partnered with Thorndike Press to investigate what was the impact of large print on students. So we had a number of research questions that drove this particular study. Here are just a sampling of some of those research questions that drove the design and implementation of the study itself. We wanted to understand, so what was the impact of large print on students' reading skill development, their self-efficacy regarding their reading abilities? How did they feel about reading? And did those changes, if any, in feelings about reading actually manifest themselves in different types of reading behaviors? And then, of course, we wanted to look at some academic outcomes or results. We also wanted to know, were these type of outcomes that we were witnessing through the study, did they actually only apply to a small handful of students, only certain types of students, certain types of readers, or were there something that could be translatable to all students so that there was greater generalizability of the study results? And then we also really wanted to understand the teacher perspective. So what were their ideas about the value of using large print within their classroom? Did they want to continue to use large print? Did they want that to be supported by their library? Were they interested in including that in their classroom collections? Next slide, please. So what we did for this study is we actually designed what we call a two-armed study. So the study included both a quasi-experimental study as well as a correlational study. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what those terms mean and how that manifests itself in the study in just a moment. We recruited 15 schools from across the country, a very diverse set of schools, urban, rural, and suburban schools, to participate in the study. Additionally, we had a sub-cohort of schools who agreed to be part of the quasi-experimental study. Now, what we meant by that was that we were able to do a side-by-side comparison with similar students, similar grade levels, the same students, reading the same book, some of them reading the traditionally sized print, some of them reading the large print. Now, this was a very large study that we conducted. There was almost 1,700 students in grades 3 through 12 that were part of the study. We were working across the country with 56 teachers and librarians. Now, we collected both quantitative and qualitative data as part of the study. We did that through surveys. I also did a series of focus groups around the country with the students, did interviews with their teachers. And in addition to that, we also looked at student achievement data. I'll also tell you a little bit more about that when we get into the results of the study. Now, what was really interesting to us was not just the data collection or even the analysis, but the reporting of the key findings. So in the development of the report, the national report on the findings, we very specifically looked at making it highly actionable for librarians and teachers, so that you could take this national report and really be able to understand what the impact was of large print, and also to be able to look to see if you could see similar results in your students and also with your teachers. Next slide, please. So here's the summary of the results of the research study. And once again, the report goes into a lot more detail, folks. So I'm just giving you kind of the headlines here in terms of these summary conclusions. What we found as a result of doing the study was that the large print text could be a valuable literacy intervention actually for all types of learners. It was not just for striving readers or low-level readers or readers that were below grade level. In fact, we saw impact and outcomes across all types of readers and learners in grades 3 through 12. We also were able to quantify that the large print books improve students' reading comprehension levels. I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. But what I think was particularly interesting was also the changes that we were able to witness in terms of students' mindsets about their own reading abilities and also their confidence level. The idea of increasing student self-efficacy as a reader, as a learner, is really important. And so it was really fascinating for us to see the correlation between the use of the large print books and those type of new mindsets. We also saw that there was interest on the teacher's part, both in terms of having large print in their school library as well as in their classroom collections. And many of us talked to the value of that around equity and inclusion. As we talk more and more in K-12 education about personalizing learning, customizing learning, individualizing learning for each student's needs, this opportunity to be able to address equity and inclusion through the use of large print was a very significant finding. We also found that this was actually a pretty easy intervention to be able to implement with teachers in classrooms, because it did not require them to change their instructional practices or even need special training. It was really just swapping out the traditional print book for the large print version of that same book. We also found as a final conclusion, and once again, these are just the headlines, folks, was that across the board, both the students and the teachers really liked the experience of using the large print books. And they saw great potential in it, not only in increasing student engagement, but improving reading comprehension as well. And across the board, the students and teachers wanted to have continued access to the large print books, and they saw high valuation in that type of an experience. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to do now is change gears a little bit on you and give you some basic information about the Esser funding qualifications. Now, I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with the Esser funding that your schools and districts have been receiving. That is the latest funding stream as a result of the pandemic, starting with CARES funding and then continuing through with the Esser funds that were released most recently. Included in the legislation around the Esser funding was the requirement that interventions, tools, solutions, new learning models that were going to utilize that funding stream needed to be able to prove that they were evidence-based. The 4 tiers of evidence-based interventions was first released and introduced in the Every Student Succeeds Act, was known as ESSA, several years ago. Now, each one of these tiers of evidence is important and valued. I don't want you to think that one is more important or valued than the other in terms of qualification for ESSER funding. They all qualify, but it's important to understand the distinctions between the different types of evidence. So I'm going to take you through a brief review of the different types of evidence so that you can understand what they mean. And then we're going to look at where this particular study that I just told you about qualifies at what tier of evidence. So the top tier, or what's known as tier 1, strong evidence, is one that has not only one or more well-designed and well-implemented studies, but that those studies are considered experimental studies. In that case, there is a control group, that is a group of students, and another group of students called the treatment group that get access to the intervention. They are randomly selected to be in those 2 groups. So it would be as if I said, all right, student A gets picked out of a hat and put in the control group, and then we pick another name out of a hat and that person is in the treatment group. We are not purposefully designing a study in this case where students are segmented into those different studies with some type of a formula or idea in mind. It is totally randomized. That type of study is very difficult to implement in an educational setting, and thus you will find that it is rare to have a true experimental study in a K-12 education setting. Now, a tier 2 moderate evidence intervention is one that is supported again by a well-designed, well-implemented study. In this case, it's called a quasi-experimental study. Again, we have a control and a treatment group being the groups of students that are getting the intervention, control group or not, but they are not randomly assigned, they are purposefully assigned. That will make more sense to you when I explain how this particular study I'm talking about meets that moderate evidence level. So tier 1 and tier 2 are very similar to one another. They both have control groups and treatment groups. Tier 2 is a purposeful distinction or differentiation between the control and treatment groups. Tier 1, they are randomly assigned. Tier 3, promising evidence, again, has to be a well-designed, well-implemented study. In this case, we're looking at the relationship between the intervention and outcomes. Those are called correlational studies. And then tier 4 is the type of study that demonstrates a rationale. In this particular case, those studies have a well-defined logic model or theory of action, depending upon your terminology. They're supported by research such as this report from the study that we did, and have some current effort underway by a local education agency, a school or district, or a state education agency, or an outside research organization to determine their effectiveness. Let's go to the next slide, please. So for the particular study that I'm sharing information about with you about the large print and the impact of large print on student outcomes, we qualified that study as both moderate evidence and promising evidence, tier 2 and tier 3. Remember, I mentioned that this study was designed with what's called 2 arms. The first arm was to develop the correlational relationship between the impact of large print and student outcomes. So that part of the study, the correlational study, qualifies under promising evidence tier 3. We had a subset of schools that agreed to be part of the quasi-experimental study, where we looked at the difference between students that were reading the same books that in a traditional format versus in a large print. So for that smaller segment of our overall study population that participate in the quasi-experimental level, that part of the study qualifies as moderate evidence, tier 2. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through the criterion for both the tier 2 and the tier 3 and explain to you how this particular study that we're talking about met the requirements at each one of those levels. I'm also going to give you some of the evidence points, the statistical information that we collected and analyzed, so you can understand what the outcomes can be. So for this one, this is the quasi-experimental study. The tier 2 evidence is what we were aiming for here. In this particular case, the evidence is borne forth by having a control and treatment group that is not random, but purposeful. So in this particular case, we had the schools that had agreed to be part of this part of the study and had them participate in the following way. In many cases, it was the same teachers or similar teachers. It was the same grade level, the same types of students, the same types of readers reading the same book. Half of them were in the control group, meaning they read the traditional book, and half were in the intervention group or treatment group, and they read the large print. But we minimized any of the variables associated with that by, once again, same book, same grade level, same type of students. In most cases, it was the same teacher. Otherwise, it was a teacher that was a very similar level and had similar instructional practices in their classroom. So in terms of the research design for tier 2, it needs to be quasi-experimental, and this study met that requirement. It also, the tier 2 criterion also includes what is called significance. There had to be a statistically significant favorable effect for the outcome. In our statistical testing, we also met that requirement. Now, the Esser requirements for evidence also mandates that for the tier 2 criterion, it needs to be what they qualified as a large study sample of a minimum of 350 participants in diverse settings. So for this particular aspect of the study, we had 423 students that were in the treatment group reading the large print book, and 428 students were in the control group. So we easily met that requirement. These were all, for this particular part of the study, were middle school and high school students. And we had about half of them in urban settings and half of them in rural settings. The requirements are also to have at least 2 sites. For this particular part of the study, we had 5 study schools that participated in this arm, this quasi-experimental arm. Okay, next slide, please. So here's some of the evidence that came from the analysis of looking at this tier 2 quasi-experimental study. In this particular case, we were looking to improve that reading mindset that I mentioned and also the students' self-efficacy. So as a true quasi-experimental study and based on our analysis, we need to be able to share with you what the results were from the control group as well as from the treatment group. So we asked the students about their confidence in their reading abilities as a result of the reading experience with whatever the particular book was, either in the large print or in the traditional print. 41% of the students in the treatment group said that the reading of that large print book increased their confidence in their reading abilities. Only 25% of the students that were reading the traditional print book felt that they had increased confidence as a result of that reading experience. The students themselves reported on their increased reading comprehension. Now, I'm going to give you in just a moment or two some of the data statistics that we looked at in terms of looking at student achievement, but this was based on the students reporting their own belief, their own self-efficacy in their increased reading comprehension. That was true for 55% of the students in the treatment group, 45% of the students in the control group. And then we also looked at some other metrics. And again, I'm just giving you a few of the highlights here, folks. You're going to want to read the report in full to get all of the details. But we looked at a couple different metrics that could give us evidence of either an increased enjoyment in reading, increased confidence in reading, The students wanted to read more as a result of this experience. There were several different types of metrics that we looked at. What I pulled here for you was that the students said they read more outside of school because of having the particular experience with their reading book. 48% of the students in the treatment group that were reading the large print book reported that they were reading more outside of school on their own after having had that reading experience. About a third of the students in the control group felt the same. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now let's look at the other part of the study. This is the one that qualifies for tier 3 evidence. This is the correlational study. So this is the study where we were looking at the relationship between the use of the large print formatted books and various outcomes. In particular, we were looking around that idea of the mindsets again and the student self-efficacy, but we also looked at quantitative reading comprehension results as part of this analysis. Again, we met the requirement for statistically significant favorable outcomes, favorable effect by outcome. And we also met the requirement for large study sampling. Again, with tier 3, the requirement from Esser is a minimum of 350 participants. As I mentioned earlier, we had about almost 1,700 students, grades 3 through 12, 56 teachers and librarians. Our settings were urban, rural, and suburban communities. All the schools qualified as Title I schools, and 2/3 of the schools were serving students, primarily students of color. We had 15 elementary, middle, and high schools participating in the correlational aspect of the study. The requirement is at least 2 sites, so we met that requirement as well. Okay, next slide, please. So I've got 2 different outcomes here in terms of the evidence to share with you. The first one is about improved reading self-efficacy. Remember, I mentioned that before. And again, same intervention. The students were provided with large print formatted books. These were replacements for their traditional books. So if the students were reading The Outsiders as part of their curriculum or part of the teacher's instructional plan, all we did was swap out the traditionally printed Outsiders for the large print version. So we had a couple different evidence points as a result of this intervention. As you can see here, 56% of the students, elementary, middle, and high school across all grades, said they enjoyed reading more when they were able to read a large print book. Now, I note here this is significant. One of the things that we collected in our pre-survey data was students' level of enjoyment or how much they liked reading for schoolwork. It is quite notable that 2/3 of the students, again, elementary, middle, and high school students, said that they did not like reading for schoolwork previously. So the fact that we saw that level of an increase in students saying that they enjoyed reading more when they were reading a large print book was very significant. We also understood and heard this from teachers as well as from the students themselves, that sometimes, particularly if students do not feel confident in their reading abilities, the idea of having a reading assignment or being told they need to do reading, particularly reading out loud, create a very high level of stress and anxiety. This is also notable, folks, because what we're seeing in some of the other research that we're doing is, in fact, middle school and high school students already have a high degree of stress about school. Some of that is the result of the pandemic and the recent disruptions in school formats. Some of it just has to do with school can be anxiety producing for many students. So the fact that our middle school students said that their stress and anxiety about reading decreased by 43% when they had access to a large print book is incredibly significant. Not only in terms of this particular intervention, but also in terms of helping to lower or lessen the overall stress and anxiety that students have about school in general. Again, another finding here that was similar to what we saw in the quasi-experimental study evidence was that high school students said they were reading longer with the large print text than with traditionally formatted books. And then I also was really impressed by this particular statistic. And, you know, it was interesting in this study that we were looking not just at middle school students, not just at high school students, but included elementary students as well as middle school and high school students in the study, so that we really had the full depth and breadth of the student population in terms of what their reading experiences were. And the teachers noted this finding as well, that in particular, their elementary students were better able to stay focused with reading because of the large print. Sabin mentioned the font size, the type of print that was used, the spacing between the lines, the margins, all of that contributed to helping the students track better when they were reading. And also that the students were not as easily distracted. So the students themselves saw this, the elementary students noted this in particular, but the teachers across all grade levels also noted that as an outcome. Next slide, please. The second outcome that we took a look at that also provides you with tier 3 evidence has to do with improved student achievement. So as part of the study, and this was designed from the beginning, we wanted to be able to understand if there were some tangible outcomes, some quantitative outcomes from the large print reading experience that could be used as evidence. We did not, however, want to come in with a special reading assessment or some type of reading comprehension tool or quiz that was outside of what teachers were using in their everyday classroom experience. We wanted to lean more into what was the regular way that teachers themselves, or the more standard way that teachers were assessing their students' achievement, and in particular their reading comprehension. In the report, we go into a lot of detail about all of the different types of quantitative input that we got around student achievement and student outcomes. Because as you can imagine, people are using all sorts of different types of assessment measures, whether it's, an accelerated reader quiz, or they were looking at some standardized tests, or in some cases, they were looking at some different types of scoring mechanisms. I just gave you a couple of them here. Again, I highly recommend taking a look at the report. So for this particular elementary classroom, we took a look at their Lexile reading averages and saw that as a result of the reading the large print books over a period of time, the classroom average increased 120 Lexile points, bringing the overall class average from below grade level to grade level reading. That was very significant, obviously, not only for the teacher, but also in terms of preparing the students during this year-long study to be ready for their next grade level. We also, we thought this one was really interesting. This one had to do with an accelerated reader quiz. We took a look at 5th grade students that were reading a number of large print books, and looked at one particular class where in fact the teacher had assigned Hatchet as the reading assignment. It was coming in at a 6th grade reading level. And it was definitely above where the students had been prior in terms of their reading level. And so the teacher was a little concerned about it, but again, in the large print, she wanted to see if there was a difference there. On most of their AR quizzes prior to this particular intervention, the average student reading comprehension was coming in at 74%, and those were all with 5th grade appropriate reading level books. So the students read Hatchet and scored on average 90% on their reading comprehension. So this did lead us to look further into that and to make some conclusions about the efficacy of the large print in terms of impacting students' reading comprehension. And then another Lexile reading level result. In this particular case, these were middle school readers who actually increased their Lexile reading level. It depended on the student 2 to 3 times whatever was the recommended growth for students in middle school. And so we also felt that was significant. Next slide, please. So this particular study, as I've given you the evidence here, qualifies under the tier 2 moderate evidence. That was the quasi-experimental part. That's where we had the control and the treatment group, the control group being the students that were reading the traditional print book, and we compared that to the experience that the students had reading the large print. That part of the study qualifies as tier 2 moderate evidence. The large complete study, the comprehensive study with the 1,700 students, that qualifies as promising evidence. That's where we saw a relationship, a correlation between the intervention, the use of the large print books, and various student outcomes, as I shared with you here. Next slide, please. So there's many more resources for you to help with this. I've mentioned the study several times. The actual national report on the study findings is available here. The URL is here for you to be able to download and use that, share with your colleagues. It's a great report to even have a discussion group. It could be part of a professional learning community, thinking about if you are interested in implementing large print in your schools and districts. We also have created a couple additional materials for you to help. One of the recommendations we have is that we believe that if you wanted to replicate the large print study, the correlational aspect, looking at the evidence that points to a relationship between the use of the large print and student outcomes, that one that yielded the tier 3 evidence, we have created a guide to help you do that. So if you want to do that in your schools, in your district, there is this guide, which will be available soon to be able to give you access to a step-by-step process to do that. Included in that will be a research guide from Project Tomorrow based on all of our work doing studies such as this to help you understand how to analyze your data results, hopefully to get the same type of tier 3 evidence that we're seeing here. As I mentioned before, the report is something that you can use as you're starting your own study, even if you're at the tier 4 promising evidence. The study can be used to give you that sort of validation. And of course, I would love to have you contact us at Project Tomorrow in case you need any help with your study design, your implementation, your analysis. We'd be happy to help you. So thanks so much, folks, for giving me the opportunity to share with you the information from the study and also to talk about the Esser funding and those 4 tiers of evidence. I'm now going to turn this over to Dr. Norman, who's going to talk to us about her experiences in her district. Dr. Norman.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. That was great information and about the report and the study by Project Tomorrow. So I'm from Birmingham City School, located in Birmingham, Alabama, and I'm going to talk to you about my district's experience with funding and with our large print books. Next slide, please. We're an urban district. We have 42 schools, about 22,000 students that cover about 99 neighborhoods in Birmingham, Alabama. Next slide, please. So I was introduced to the large prints actually at a conference, at an AASL conference. And I thought, you know, this was a wonderful resource. What could I do to bring this back to our district? And so at the time, my particular sales rep was Sabin, who introduced us at the very beginning. And so she provided a wealth of information at that conference for me and also sent back brochures that I could share to my particular librarians. My librarians were really enthusiastic. And so we decided to bring her in on a professional development day. And so on that particular day, she provided books for everyone, pamphlets so that they can actually look at the results and the different studies. And then we started those conversations. At the time, we didn't know what type of funding we were actually going to utilize, but we always try to find a way to enhance our student learning. So we don't worry about funding in the beginning. We find those resources that we really like and we really want in our schools. And then we try to seek funding after that. So next slide, please. So we held those informational meetings. And then also at those meetings, we brought in our ELA coordinators. We have 3 ELA coordinators, one for our K-5, one for 6-8, and another one for 9-12. And so we actually brought them into the conversation also, because you want buy-in, not only from the librarians, but you want buy-ins from everyone in the district so that you can share the vision with everyone. At that point, when we decided, you know, this would be a great resource for our students here in Birmingham City Schools, all of a sudden, resources showed up. We were able to have extra resources from the state of Alabama decided, you know what, we have not been funding our libraries the way that we should over the past few years. And so they, through the legislature, passed a bill that we received additional funding for our libraries. And so we were able to purchase all the books. So we offered every one of our libraries, all 42, a starter set. But with that starter set, they were actually able to customize. So if there were some books that they didn't feel that would that their students would enjoy and that it would not fit their particular population, then they actually were able to swap out those books. They were able to get, in some instances, 5 books for a particular book title so that they can do a book study. And then if they didn't need those, then they just kept swapping out. So every one of our libraries had customized sets, because every school is not the same. It doesn't matter if you're in the same district, every school is different. And so our librarians were really excited about that. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at the books, they look exactly the same. So we're looking at this image right now. When we think about textbooks, because I'm over textbooks also, sometimes those large print textbooks are huge. They're 11 by 17. You may be able to get 1 chapter in a book per volume, but that's not the case in our Thorndike large print book. The books look similar, as you can see right there on the screen. And in some instances, they're a bit smaller than an actual regular, what we would call a regular traditional book. And so we were really excited that we were able to pick titles that were just on their list, no books that we had to request to actually be made or anything, that they had books that were crucial to our particular population. We have probably about a 90% African American, probably about a 10% Hispanic population here in Birmingham City Schools. And with that, we want to make sure that our libraries have books that our students can actually see in them. Next slide, please. We don't separate books in our libraries. We want to make sure that our students, regardless of who they are, that they're able to go to the shelves with every other student. And with that, that's what we're doing with our Thorndike print books. We are actually allowing our students to just pick books. It doesn't matter if it's the large print book. It doesn't matter if it's a traditional book. We want to make sure our students are fostering the love of reading. And that's what's important. So we had some of our schools to say that their large print books are checked out about 90% of the time. We had a high school to actually say that some of her students enjoy the books not only because they look exactly the same, but because it helps improve their vision. We have some students who wear glasses, as we have at every other school. And of course, at that point, they're able to see the print better. And so they have decided, you know what, I'm going to seek out those large print books in the library if those books are possible at that time. So next slide, please. When you're looking for funding, of course, we know that we do have the new Esser funding, but we also have funding through your special education department. You have funding through your 504 coordinator, your literacy directors, your curriculum and instruction director. So when you're looking for funding, seek those other sources also, because we are all trying to get to the same place. We're all educating our students to make sure that they are the best that they can be, to become avid readers, to make sure that they are a productive citizen. And so with the collaboration of all the departments, I know that you can find funding. You also have to advocate. You have to advocate for your district. You have to advocate for your library. So if you find that this particular product, which I know it will be beneficial to your school, you need to make sure that you're advocating. Go to your neighborhood association and ask for funding. Ask your administrator for additional funding. But you need to make sure that you are actually advocating and you have a seat at that table to make sure that the things that you need are provided for you. We want to make sure that our students, all of our students, regardless of who they are, have the same opportunities as everyone else. as the project tomorrow stated, the test scores. When you provide reading opportunities for our students, the more, we always know, the more students read, the more they learn comprehension and the more they learn to love the gift of reading. So in the library, we want to make sure that we are providing resources for them to have that love of reading. Next slide.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Christina and Julie. It's really so inspiring to hear you share your expertise and your experience on how youth large print improves engagement and those foundational reading skills. And also, I really enjoyed listening to Christina share how she developed and advocated, I mean, that's such a strong word, that she advocated for large print collections at all of her schools in Birmingham City School District, and certainly giving every one of her students opportunity. That's fabulous. Attendees, Dr. Evans mentioned that we both have study findings and a research guide, which you can download from the webinar platform. A copy of the guide will also be coming to your inbox from Booklist. You can access the literacy research along with all those available amazing large print titles. Christina threw out a few. You saw Dr. Evans share some also. And you can find those and all this information at gale.com/Thorndike/YLP, which stands for Youth Large Print. Before we start audience Q&A, we wanted to share a short video from author Jeff Kinney. Next slide, please.
Hey everyone, it's Jeff Kinney, author of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid series, and I'm so proud to be holding in my hand a large format print version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, published by Thorndike Press. Thank you so much for making my books more accessible to so many readers. As we all know, the more you read, the more fulfilled you'll be in life, the happier you'll be. So I'm so happy that my stories are getting told in this format, which is so much more accessible. A few years back, I got to meet a young girl who had vision problems, and having this would really help her out to be able to enjoy my stories in a way that's really right for her. So I want to remind classrooms, libraries, schools that Esser funds are available. I hope you guys will get your hands on Diary of a Wimpy Kid in large format by Thorndike Press.
Thank you so much, Sabin, Julie, Christina, and Jeff. That was a great little video. We'll now move to the Q&A portion of the presentation. If you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I'm going to kick off with a question for Christina. What value do you see in large print with your young readers?
So the value that I see for our younger readers is it gives them a difference in the type of literature that they can see. I think that every time you're able to put a book in the hand of a child, then that increases their love of reading. It gives them an opportunity to also see different types, different print sets. You can actually have a lesson on it, to be honest. You can talk about the different print sets, the type sets, why you might have larger print libraries. And so you're able to do that.
Excellent. So now, Julie, I have a question for you. What surprised you most about the large print study?
That's a great question. Gosh, there were so many things that I was impressed with. I think the thing that probably surprised me the most was the impact on students' self-efficacy as a reader. Dr. Norman kind of pointed to that as well. But this idea that the students could feel better about themselves, that they were more interested in reading, that it wasn't just about the reading comprehension, not to say that wasn't important, but I love the sustainability of the fact that the students felt better about themselves as readers and wanted to read more. They felt more comfortable in the reading environment. You know, that was particularly noteworthy for me, for the students that we worked with that were in high school. And let's think about that. Some of those high school readers had been striving readers for a long time and had not had the right tools in their hands to make them feel good about reading. And one of the focus groups that I did, Susan, gosh, this was so much fun. One of the focus groups that I did was at an all-boys school in the Fort Worth area. And the students had been reading a large print book, and these were struggling readers at the time. And they actually, as part of my focus group, started a debate between each other about some of the story elements, the plot, the setting, the characters in the story. And the teacher was witnessing this whole thing, and she said she had just never seen them so enthusiastic about reading anything that had to do with schoolwork. So I think it was really about the changes in the mindset, the self-efficacy, the confidence, and really, as Dr. Norman said, you know, creating lifelong readers as part of an outcome from this, from using the large print. That was really fabulous to see.
That's great. So we've got a couple of questions from the audience. This one, I think, Sabin, I think this one's for you. What was the size of the collection to start the large print library? How many titles?
Yeah, so for Christina at Birmingham, I believe, Christina, we started with about 50 to 60 titles for each collection, for the elementary, middle school, and high school. Our starter or opening day collections, our recommended collections vary. Typically, most school districts are similar to what Christina did, anywhere from 50 to 85 titles to start off with, because that ensures you have a nice collection of titles. So once students introduced to one of those titles and they enjoy the large print format, they have others to come back to.
Cool. So I have two questions about the funding. The first is from a public library. Is funding available for public libraries?
Sure, I'll jump in on that one also, because I also work with public libraries across the nation. So there is funding out there. I believe it's called the ARPA funding. Many of the state libraries offered it in different ways, some in grants, but you could look into that and see what's available for ARPA funding. In addition, we have a lot of public libraries that are reaching out to their community and will ask for funding from their community, whether it's a Lions Club, whether it's simply the credit union, a local bank in your area. They look to their friend's library to help create a collection, an initial collection for their library of youth large print. That seems to be the most successful. What I would recommend, if anybody has funding questions on how to get funding, to reach out to us, because we have a list of different funding resources and grant opportunities.
Great. And so the next funding question is, as the participant pointed out, buying large print books is a great idea, but we need money to do it. So how do we get Esser funds?
Christina, is that something that you'd be more comfortable speaking to? Because I can do it, but from a school, it'd be great coming from you.
I don't mind.
Great.
So Esser funds is a funding source that is called Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. And that funding actually came about after COVID. So if you are a public school system, then you have Esser funds. Now that Esser fund is at the district level, but that's why I was talking about advocating and collaborating with the individuals at the district level. I'm very fortunate that I'm in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And with curriculum and instruction, I am able to obtain Esser funds through my district, because my district supports libraries. I also want to state that that I forgot to mention that the state of Alabama also provides funding for school-based librarians in every one of our public schools. So the state actually provides a library, and I know that that is not the case across the country. But if you are a public school, then please collaborate. You know, you have to speak up saying, hey, I want this particular item that is paid for through Esser funds. So there are different we're on Esser 2 now. So there was an Esser 1, now we're on Esser 2, and then there's an Esser 3 that will be coming up. With this, school districts have to submit a plan on how they're actually going to spend that money. And so that's why it's good to have a seat at the table to make sure that your voice is heard so that you can have these type of resources in your school.
Great. Now I have not a question, but a comment, but I think we'll have some responses to it from the panel. Sometimes it's the teacher, not the student or the teacher librarian, that has the problem with large print books. Some high school teachers call large print books baby books, which shows their ignorance. Students aren't reading over each other's shoulders. So does anyone want to respond to that one?
I don't mind starting, Julie. It looks like you might have a thought or two there. So the first thing I want to say is get a book and show it to those teachers, because they just do not realize. They think the old school large print 25 years ago that was big and bulky, that was 2 volumes and had horrible covers and that would stand out like a sore thumb. And they don't recognize and realize that those books look the same. They look identical. There's no stigma, and they're certainly not baby books. The kids prefer them. And Julie, you probably want to speak to that, because that preference of having large print. So I'll let you talk to a little bit about it.
Thank you, Sabin. Yeah, we definitely saw that in the study. You know, we started the study by doing a series of focus groups and interviews with teachers and librarians and principals. And I literally brought in same titles, large print and traditional print, and put them side by side for the teachers, the librarians, and the school principals. And they were amazed. It did, just as Sabin said, it sort of changed their mindset about what large print was. We didn't get any pushback. The teachers expected it, but didn't. We didn't get any pushback across those 1,700 students nationwide about feeling awkward using the book or wondering if that stigmatized them in any ways. The teachers were very tuned into thinking about that, because as Sabin said, they sort of had an old mindset about the large print. But the students loved the experience so much. I mean, several of the students told me in the focus groups I did, I wish every school book I had at school looked like this. So the value was the most important thing for the students.
This is great. You guys are giving large print a whole new street cred. I love it. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Julie, how long would you recommend a study last? A month, a quarter, a semester? What?
Yeah, so we ran that. That's a great question, Susan. Thank you. The study we ran was almost a full year, because we wanted to give the teachers and the schools plenty of opportunity to use their existing curricular titles, but only in the large print format. So, you know, someone might have been doing a particular book in November, somebody else might have been doing it in February. So we did run the study over a long period of time. I think you want to be able to look at a couple different titles. And I think if that means that through your instructional plan, through your curriculum guide, that's a couple of months, I think that is an adequate study period to look at it over that time. If you have the opportunity to do something like on a semester-wide basis, or even a full year, you're going to get a lot more data, you're going to get a lot more impact. But I think if you have the opportunity to take a couple titles, work those into your, to the way that teachers are using the books within their standards, within their curriculum, I think that would be really successful. That would be my recommendation.
Great. So we have 1 more question from the audience, I guess is the word. It's from a children's librarian who's working with pre-K to elementary, middle, and high schools, providing programming and services to younger patrons. And how can they introduce this rich information and get the conversation started on how we can procure and start providing large print books in our public library collection for children, tweens, and possibly even teens, and not just what we were talking about, the regular large print collection that's already present for adults. Sabin, did you want to answer that one?
Yeah, that's a good question for me. So I would just say to you, reach out to me, reach out to us. I'll shoot my email address to you, but we can work with you to help you promote, educate, the value of youth large print to those that are within your library. So it's to your colleagues and even outside. We have rich resources also available on our website that will help you do that on your own. If you want me to come in and talk, I can, but you can do it yourself. We have infographics, we have free downloadable materials on our website where you can share with parents, with students, with colleagues, both teachers and also colleagues in the public library. So we really wanted to make sure that we've created a wealth of information for you to tell the story. So whether you're looking to talk to your colleagues about it or you're looking to go and find funding from different resources, we have the materials for you to tell a strong story. But we're also here to support you with coming in and doing some PD and talking both virtually and potentially if I'm around and can travel in person too.
Great. So that's all the time we have today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll pass along unanswered questions to our panelists after the presentation, and then they can get in touch with you with their answers. Thank you so much to Julie and Christina for sharing your expertise with us today. On Monday, all attendees will receive follow-up communications that include webinar materials from today's presentation. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming ones like the ones you see here. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. One more huge thank you to our panelists and to our sponsor, Thorndike Press. This concludes today's webinar.